All right, welcome to Writing Workshop. Here we are at session 8. Writers are going to be revising their research reports to include multiple perspectives on the same topic. My friends, this is how we do it. First of all, you have to find a resource or some resources that present different opinions on your topic or one of your subtopics. And then you got to decide what part of that resource best shows the contrast between maybe two people or two groups of people. And from there, you have to decide where are you going to include the information in your research report. And then you got to write. You got to think about things like how you're going to introduce the information and transitions and all that good business to get this work done. Now, very handily, I have included in this assignment, ta-da! Useful transitional phrases. You know them, you love them, you've seen them in our many units on essay, and I brought them back here because I think it's going to be really helpful for you. So I have included here some really good transitional phrases for introducing some information or some evidence, unpacking the information or the evidence, and then here, transitioning to a different opinion or contrasting, right? So where you have, information about one group and then you want to present the information about the other group, right here are some prompts, some transitional phrases that are going to help you to do that work. On the other hand, this contrasts with, because, okay, those kinds of things. I think that's going to be super helpful to do this work. Now, this should be a little familiar with you because in our last lesson, I sort of touched on the different perspectives. I showed you in this example here from a magazine article where the magazine had presented in the article the opinions of two different groups of people on the same event or subject. So this one, if you remember, was about President Trump and the immigration situation. And so the title of the subtopic for the article was that not everyone agrees there's an emergency. And I'm just going to lay it out for you. I'm going to do some highlighting here of what this author is doing. So first of all, right here in the beginning, they are kind of introducing the topic. Is there a crisis at the U.S. border with Mexico? Trump says yes. Boom. I'm already in it. I know what we're going to be talking about. Next, they select a really good quote from President Trump that really precisely articulates, like it gives his opinion about the topic. He says, "We have an invasion of drugs, invasion of gangs, invasion of people, and it's unacceptable." Right? There's a really short and sweet quote for him. We have no doubt in our minds what President Trump is thinking here. Over here, if you'll notice, there's a little bit of a transitional phrase, but many experts disagree. You see how they did that? There's a little transitional phrase. So we know, all right, we're done talking about President Trump and his side of the issue. Now we're going to move on to what another group thinks about this particular issue. And then bam, here we have some information from them. The experts disagree. They say there's no national emergency at the border. Dozens of former U.S. security officials have criticized the declaration. There is short, to the point, sweet. We know exactly and precisely what the other group feels, right? And then here at the end, I think it's really interesting. I wanted to show you this. They kind of tie this back into the whole topic of immigration. So they say that critics say a wall would have little effect on their flow into the country. Their flow meaning the flow of immigrants into the country. So this is kind of like making you think about like the whole immigration issue. And so that's the kind of thing that you are going to be doing in your work. I know you might be a little scared. However, I'm going to take you through it step by step. Let's do this. So I did this in my own writing. Step 1, find a resource or resources that present information, different opinions on your topic or one of your subtopics. So you all know I'm doing the Trail of Tears. I am researching this. And in the course of my research, I found where President Andrew Jackson, had actually gone to Congress and made this like speech in front of Congress where he talked about this Indian Removal Act and kind of how it's going. So to be honest with you, I didn't read the whole speech. I kind of had to skim through it because it was really a lot of information, but I was able to come across some information that I think I could use. Okay. Now, similarly, I also came across in my research a court case where the Cherokee had gone to the Supreme Court and said, like, stop the Indian Removal Act. Please, you got to have an injunction. That means you got to halt the Indian Removal Act. It's not fair. And so I have two resources now that I can now use to help me with this work of including multiple perspectives in the same topic. Because Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, feels entirely differently about the Indian Removal Act than the Cherokee people. So I'm going to highlight that in my writing. All right, but step 2, I got to really narrow it down. I have to decide what part of the resource is the best, what shows the contrast between the two groups or the two people. So I got to think, how can I quote or paraphrase the information to highlight the differences between the groups or the people? So when I was kind of skimming through this speech that President Jackson gave, I kind of came across this first part where he first starts talking about the Indian Removal Act. And he says in it, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years, in relation to the removal of Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching a happy consummation." Whoa, 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 whoa. First of all, benevolent, it means it's like, this policy is like caring and kind. And then over here, a happy consummation, like it's about to begin. So basically, he's saying in this like one sentence right here that, listen, we are doing this law. The Indians love it. It's going to be great. I think that really sums up how Andrew Jackson feels about this, or at least how he's trying to like pretend that he feels so he can get this law going. I have a feeling the Cherokee are going to feel really differently about that. Okay, and yet, here we go. If I skimmed and scanned through this, I found this piece of information about how the Cherokee felt. Their lawyer is at the Supreme Court and presenting their case that this law should be stopped. And so he says, the legislation of Georgia proposes to annihilate them. Annihilate means like destroy, right? And its very end, aim. If those laws be fully executed, there will be no Cherokee boundary, no Cherokee nation, no Cherokee lands, no Cherokee treaties. They will all be swept out of existence together, leaving nothing but the monuments in our history of the enormous injustice that have been practiced towards a friendly nation. Boom, smoke, fire. Right there, the Cherokee lawyer lays out the case that if this law goes through, the Cherokee will be no more, or at least they'll be no more as they were originally were. And you know what? Because we're, 100 and some years later, we know that happens to be true, right? That actually happened almost 200 years later. So this is a very good quote here. I might want to like narrow it down a little bit because it's a lot of words there. But I think I've got some really good information for this that I can just narrow down. All right. So my next topic, the next thing I've got to do, the next step, once I have my information, I even narrowed it down to like, 1 or 2 sentences for each perspective, each opinion. Now I'm going to decide where am I going to put the information in my research report. I'll be real with you. I'm getting kind of chunky with this work here. Like, this is my report. It's into 2 pages. This is my first page and this is my second page. I got to figure out where I'm going to put this. Now, it is about the Indian Removal Act, and I do have a section about the Indian Removal Act right here, and it is kind of smaller. I do feel like of my sections, that could be a section that I could include in there, although I do have the timeline there. So you know what? Actually, now I'm thinking about it, I want to include this information, maybe not in the Indian Removal Act, but maybe as its own separate thing after the Indian Removal Act. So it's still kind of part of it, but it's sort of after it, because it's kind of showing the relationship and how the two groups, President Andrew Jackson and the Cherokees, kind of felt about this situation, about the Indian Removal Act. So I think I'm going to squeeze it in between here, right before I talk about what life was like on the trail. Okay, so I decided instead of putting it in its own subsection, I'm going to put it in an existing I'm going to make it its own subsection, not part of an existing subsection. Okay, that's my logic there. Okay, let's do this. I got to write. I have to think, how am I going to introduce the information, and how will I transition between one person's opinion and another's? And how can I explain the significance of the information to the whole topic? That's a lot. Let me just break that down. I'm going to worry about how am I going to introduce the information. I think I want to talk about Andrew Jackson first because he passes the law in 1830, and I think the lawsuit, the Supreme Court case, was 1831, was afterwards. So I'm definitely going to talk about Andrew Jackson first. So I have to think back to some of those transitional phrases. How can I introduce this idea? Well, I think I'm going to title this section Different Perspectives, right? Because it's like different viewpoints. So I'm thinking in December 6, 1830, President Andrew Jackson spoke about the Indian Removal Act in his second annual message to Congress. The message began by him saying, okay, so right there, I'm just kind of giving the background. I'm just sort of introducing like, hey, this is where this information is coming from. And then I want to give the quote that I chose, right? It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years, in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching a happy consummation. Okay, adult that has a college education, know what the words benevolent mean and consummation. But you know what? My reader might not. And so I definitely want to make sure that I'm like giving them some kind of interpretation of this. I'm kind of telling them what this means and why it's important. So my next line is going to be where I do that work. In his speech, President Jackson presents his belief that the Indian Removal Act that is about to be carried out is benevolent, meaning generous and caring. Ooh. That's what he's saying. That's his opinion. Right there, I'm telling them what that is. Okay? So now that I have the side of Andrew Jackson, I have to think about how I'm going to transition between one Andrew Jackson and the other group's opinion, the Cherokee's opinion. What am I going to do there? I have to go back to those transitional phrases, and I have to think about what one is going to help me to do that work. Well, here I go. This contrasts completely with what the Cherokee's chief lawyer, William Wirt, argues. This contrasts completely, right? What he's saying, Andrew Jackson, is totally opposite to what the Cherokees are believing, right? So right there's my transitional phrase. The Cherokee's chief lawyer, William Wirt, argues when he goes in front of the Supreme Court to ask for an injunction, that's an order to stop the law from taking effect. Okay, so there, not only have I transitioned into the other group's opinion, but I've also kind of given a little bit of background about like what this opinion is coming from, where it's coming from. Because it would be really weird if I just dropped it in there without explaining like where this information is coming from and what is happening in history right now at that moment. So definitely make sure you're taking the time to do that work. Otherwise, it's going to be strange, and your reader, who maybe doesn't really know a lot about your particular topic, is going to be confused. Okay, so now I'm going to just drop in the quote that I chose. I kind of narrowed it down a little bit so that it wasn't too much to read. And I want to just choose just the best little bit, one sentence, maybe two. Two is pushing it. If those laws be fully executed, there will be no Cherokee boundary, no Cherokee nation, no Cherokee lands, no Cherokee treaties. They will all be swept out of existence together, leaving nothing but the monuments in our history of the enormous injustice. Ooh, that's a lot. I know you can feel like from like the tone of my voice that it's really like powerful, but I have to explain because there's a lot of information here that I think my reader needs to know about. How am I going to do that? All right, I have my quote here. I'm going to think about what this means. The Cherokee see the Indian Removal Act not as a benevolent policy, quote unquote, as President Jackson has stated, but as a tool designed to destroy their nation forever. The Cherokee lost the battle in court, and the Indian Removal Act took effect. So, but I'm showing you right there how the Cherokee felt and how it contrasts with President Jackson's feelings about the Cherokee Removal Act, or excuse me, the Indian Removal Act. And then I also am giving a little bit of information about like what would later happen. The Cherokee did lose the battle in court, and the Indian Removal Act did take into effect. The only thing I'm missing here is explain the significance of the information to the whole topic. I got to wrap this up. I got to kind of circle back on this whole thing about the Trail of Tears. So here I go. Although the Cherokee couldn't see it at any point, they fought. Although the Cherokee couldn't see it at that point, they fought on in the courts for 7 more years before removal. They were too far apart from President Jackson and the desires of many whites to take native lands for themselves. So here, I'm just pointing out kind of like what happens in the next few years with the Cherokee. And I'm also kind of showing that, like, listen, they tried to do this work in the courts. They tried to, like, find justice, but it just wasn't there for them. There were too many whites who wanted their lands, and the courts were not really being fair, ultimately. And so that kind of ties back to this whole kind of reason for the Trail of Tears, which I think is really important. Okay? And so there we go. I changed the formatting here when I went to go put it in my essay. I kind of did some italics and I indented for the quotes. Just notice I'm really only quoting like one sentence here. It is a long sentence, but it is one sentence. Over here, this one I did choose 2 sentences. I don't know. I feel like it was really powerful, so I kind of cut off one of the sentences because I felt like it was important. But again, I try to keep it pretty slim here because you want to find just the right piece of information, nothing else that really conveys the differences between these 2 groups of people. This one, Andrew Jackson, this one over here, the Cherokee, and how they felt, each of those 2 people, those groups felt about the Indian Removal Act. But you got to do the rest of it. You got to introduce the evidence. You got to make sure that you're interpreting the information and telling your reader like what that means and why it matters. You have to do the work to kind of wrap it all up and sort of connect it back to the whole topic. Okay? So, how are you going to do this? Just like I did that. I want to make sure that you're really trying to do this thinking work. Like I said, when you go into choosing what information really best shows, you really got to think about how you can quote or paraphrase the information to just highlight the differences. Really highlight. Pick some really juicy lines. Making sure that you're thinking about where this could be included. Don't just slap it on at the end. You got to be thoughtful about where would it make sense to include this information. And then when you go to actually write it, you got to do all the steps. You got to make sure that you're introducing the information. You got to make sure that you're doing those transitions. And I will be including this transitions tool that I created for you guys with the assignment. Okay, so definitely make use of that. I think it's going to really help you when you go to write here. At the end, I'm really looking to see, can you wrap this up? Can you explain the significance of that information to the whole topic? And let me tell you, you really got to make sure that you're choosing some really good people to compare and contrast, contrast there at the, for this, in order for this to kind of tie back into the whole topic. Because if it doesn't really matter to the whole topic, it's going to be hard to do that part. All right. Good luck, everybody.